Thank you Squarespace for kindly sponsoring today's video. Hello everyone, it's Jess here, and in this video we are going to be setting up a brand new watercolor palette. I'll share my color choices and the proper way to prep, so let's do it together step by step. In the previous video, I started my brand new watercolor sketchbook, and I'm really intending to do lots of painting from life with this one and really focus on some urban sketching. And I absolutely love taking my watercolors with me whenever I go out and paint. Here are my current watercolor palettes that need some serious upgrading. I haven't set up a new one in about 4 years, and this is definitely an essential component to creating in my sketchbook, and I get a ton of questions about this, so I thought it'd be great if we set a new one up together. So here are some essential supplies we'll need to create our own watercolor palette. First, you'll need an empty watercolor palette. I enjoy using these tin palettes, and they also come in different sizes. And inside the palette, we are going to be filling these half small little pans with paint and then placing them inside our palette. And the beauty about these is that you can pick your own colors and set up the palette however you wish. Now to fill these pans, you're going to need some watercolor paint. Depending on the colors that you prefer that suit your needs will be great. And when we will be filling our half pans with the paint, we will also need a toothpick or a needle to get rid of any bubbles. So let's begin with our first step. I like to spend some time picking my colors, so this way I'll know which placement I'll like in my palette as well as which ones I want to even include. After doing tons of research and trying out a few brands, I've been working with the Daniel Smith watercolors and a few other brands to create this older palette and smaller palette that I have. I also have a small book where I can swatch colors to see how they look once they're dry, and I really recommend doing this because as I'm looking at the swatches, I'm able to begin placing my colors in order to see how I'd like them to be placed in the palette. I arranged them in order from warm to cool, and for this palette I had some half pans left, so I wanted to reuse them in the new palette and arrange some colors that I have from before. And this took quite some time and lots of decision making, but here are the colors that I decided on. The top row is going to be some warm colors, the middle row is going to be all of the neutrals and browns, and the bottom row is going to be some blues and greens. And although this is a 24 pan watercolor set, it actually fits 11 more in the middle, so I decided to utilize that space to add another row in the center. I figured it would be nice to give them all a home. Now once all your colors are decided and you are ready to go, it's time for the next step, which is an important one, and it's the way that we're going to prep our palette. This is something I wasn't doing before, but after doing some research, I learned about something called beading. When you open your palette, you may notice that it's quite shiny, and once you place some water, the water or paint can actually bead up and gather into little puddles. And this may not be a huge deal to everyone, but I wanted to find a way to prevent that. Some artists showed how they use sponges, but I actually found that a little buffer for the nails can actually work well. And what we're going to do is we're just going to very lightly sand the top surface that you see over here and simply remove the shine. I really recommend going very slowly with this step. You do not want to press too hard, and I'm just gently making little circles around the area to remove the shiny part. As I'm doing this, I'm alternating between a lighter, more fine grain of the buffer and one that's a little bit harder. And I found that little circular motions worked best. And as I'm going along, I'm testing out the area with some water to see if it worked. And immediately I noticed a significant difference of no beading. So I continued to lightly move my way around the palette. I really recommend taking your time and going slow with this one, and look out to not overdo it. Now, doing some further research, I actually found some artists taking some toothpaste and taking a little bit on the finger and just rubbing it over the palette to get rid of any top layers, and this is also supposed to help with staining. So I'm going to test this out and see how it goes. I've seen some videos of artists doing tests and it seemed to work, so I decided to do this in addition. I also made sure to thoroughly wash it out with water and then quickly dried it to the touch. After doing this, you should feel a satin, less shiny finish to the sides of your palette, and once that's all done, we can move on to filling our pans with paint. But before that, a quick word about today's sponsors. Squarespace is an all-in-one place to build your website where you can showcase your online portfolio, create your online shop, all with a beautiful presence. Their selection of professional templates cannot be matched, and I myself have been using Squarespace for a few years now, and with the help of Squarespace, I was able to build my online shop all on my own, and I also absolutely loved that I was able to drag and drop all of my paintings and sketchbook images onto a gallery, and it was all beautifully laid out in one page. I also loved how Squarespace was always there to help me when needed. I've used their live chat a few times, and every single time it was just as helpful. I highly recommend building your website with Squarespace, so head over to squarespace.com for a free trial, and when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/justcarp for 10% off your purchase of a website or domain. Thank you, Squarespace, and let's jump right back into step number 3. We've prepped our palette, and now it's time to fill the pans with some paint. Over time, it can get a little bit difficult to keep track of the color names, so what I like to do, and as you can see here in this pan, I like to label them with the color as well as the brand. And I found that using a Sharpie works best to do this, and it doesn't smudge, so I'm just going from the start and placing the pan right above the tube of paint for the color so that I know to prepare it when I'm beginning to fill it. And this way, I'm staying super organized, and it's just visually easier to take care of. I also like to prepare a nice little paper towel under my pan so that everything stays neat, but this can get a little messy. Just try your best to be as neat as possible. So what I'm going to do for each pan is I'm going to be filling it very slowly, starting with the corners to reduce any bubbles or air bubbles that can occur. I'm starting off slowly by pushing the paint into the corners at the very bottom and then working my way all the way around. This can be a little tricky if you're starting off at first, but I just like to go slowly and fill it up to about halfway point. And some people like to fill it up all the way up to the top. It's up to you. But once the paint is in the little half pan, I take my needle and I just distribute the paint evenly throughout the whole pan. And I'm focusing on the corners and the middle areas to make sure that I get rid of any air bubbles that can get trapped inside. And very carefully, after that's filled, I take my pan and I place it inside the first row, and this is where it's going to begin drying. I repeat this step for all of the colors that I chose for my palette, and as I'm filling the pans, I also recommend doing a little tap motion to distribute the paint down and having it settle, and generally just take your time and enjoy the process. For this new palette, I had some half pans left over that I have purchased throughout time, so for this palette, I'm including a mix of a few brands. As you're filling the palette, you'll notice that some brands are drying and also reacting differently to each little pan that you can be filling, and that's because every brand and every pigment is different, and the consistency of each can change. As I'm filling in my palette, I just wanted to include some swatches to show you guys how each color looks when it's painted, and I'll have them all linked in the description below. But these are the colors that I decided to go with and experiment with. I've spent lots of time researching and trying out different brands, and so far I've been really happy with these. And the brands that I decided to go with are my top favorites. And I just want to note that, of course, you don't need all of these colors to create a beautiful palette. The less the better, but I've been meaning to create a home for all of the colors that I have as favorites and also upgrade the older palettes. As I'm finishing up the first row of colors, it was really satisfying to see them all coming together as a group. And with this middle section, I decided to try out some new colors that I had laying around in my watercolor box. And I designated this middle row to be for neutrals and brown tones. I wanted to focus on some paintings to have some earth colors. So when I was choosing some of the pigments, I was making sure I was thinking about what I intend to be painting with them. And the beauty is that you can always interchange your colors and switch out and swap out any of the pigments that you want with the half pans. Think of it as a learning process and an experimental curve. And as you create paintings with the colors that you choose, you'll be able to have a better understanding on what is best for you. Now I decided to include these raw sepia and ivory black tones in my palette. I usually do not use these colors, and I wouldn't use these to mix any shadow tones. But the reason why I put them there was to actually create some black and white tonal paintings and just little studies, which you guys know I'm a huge fan of. For this last bottom row, I decided to designate it for some blue tones and green tones. It was always difficult for me to find a beautiful blue and something that's bright and bold, yet also versatile. but the variations of some warm blues and some cool blues will help me create different mixtures within different colors. I usually love using the ultramarine blue as it's my favorite blue to mix things with, but I did include some new colors and brands to, again, experiment with. I'm also really excited to be setting up this new palette finally. It's been a long time coming, and to me, it was a very therapeutic, sort of meditative process. I get really excited setting up a new palette, and luckily the palettes last so long. I may also be setting up a smaller palette to take on the go as well with more limited color palette, and I figured I'd play around with this palette for a little while before making one of those. So I've officially placed all of the pans with their paint filled up. This is the most satisfying part and the cleanest that your palette will ever be. Once we've finished with filling it up, I like to take my palette and slightly close it to keep any light coming in into the paint. And then I do my best to stay as patient as possible and let my palette dry completely. Some tips I suggest is to place it in a warm place, away from direct sunlight, and of course, making sure you let it dry completely. Depending on where you are, drying time can take anywhere from 2 to 5 days, but once it's completely dry, as you can see here, there will be sort of a matte finish to your paints. However, keep in mind that some companies make their paints with honey, and I've noticed that they do stay a little bit wetter than others over time. And now for the most rewarding and exciting part, it is time to make our swatching chart. I find this super beneficial because I'm able to refer to the colors in my palette, since once they're dry in the pans, they do appear a bit darker. Here's my old swatching chart. It did get a little bit beat up, but I had a plan to fix this for the next one. So I just cut a piece of watercolor paper to size of my palette. I also made sure to measure out and match up the pans to the size of the little squares that I added on the paper, and then I just began swatching. I'm focusing on creating a gradient from more opaque at the top to less opaque going down to the bottom of the little square. And I'm taking my time, going slow, and just making sure that my brush is super clean whenever I change the color. With every row, I was changing my water as well to make sure it's nice and clean. This chart is going to be a reference for me, so I wanted the pigment to be as clean as possible. And I found that holding a paper towel beside you and wiping off any excess pigment was really helpful as well. So as I'm finishing up the swatches in my chart, I begin to see how the palette looks as a whole, and I'm really happy with the way it's coming out. As you guys can see, my top row is focusing on some yellows, reds, and warmer tones that I like towards the end, as well as darker tones, and then my middle row focuses on earth tones, and the bottom row includes some blues and greens. I noticed there was a little bit of space between the palette and the pans, so I added a little piece of styrofoam to make sure that they're not going to move around whenever I'm taking this on the go. Here's another little hack that I came up with to keep my swatch chart from getting messy. I created the illusion that it's laminated with just placing tape over the whole thing, and then I added another piece to be folding into with all the names of the colors. And here is the finished palette along with the swatching chart. I can now fold it right in and place it into my palette, and it's all ready to go. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you found it helpful, be sure to leave a thumbs up. Don't forget to check out my website for any new prints and things coming out. And you can also find me on Patreon, where I'm now offering exclusive stickers and postcards to be mailed to you. Stay creative, guys, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!